start with this talk. This is normally what is in here as an introduction to this exhibition, and it's on photography. Seeing is believing, and one of the things we want to explore is the difference between photography and painting or art in general, and because the invention of photography was revolutionary, and it really sort of totally changed the nature of art, because both photography and painting are images. So the overarching character of those two forms, in fact, is an image. And what's interesting about this image here is that we have 4 self-portraits here. So we have a verbal self-portrait, which is text, and text itself is an image. We have a painting, a monochrome painting. We have a selfie shot on an iPhone, and we have a photographic self-portrait. Each of them are different, but all of them are images. And all of them are saying something using a different medium or a different technology. And that's why I think is the sort of brunt of what we're going to be talking about. So this is one of the first images that man ever created. This is 30 to 40,000 years ago. These are caves in sort of Spain and France, and these are the sort of first images that we have records of created by humans. And when you look at it 40,000 years ago, it's actually very sophisticated. You can see the resolution, the layering, the movement, the dynamics, and with a lot of images, what it's doing is actually acting as a reflection of the world that the artists are living in. But what's also fascinating about this image is that this is an early form of human creativity, and it predates nearly everything else. Predates writing, predates architecture, predates technology, predates agriculture. So what it is about the human psyche that needs to produce an image in their development as humans so early in their development? So this is the early stage. So this was probably 30, 40,000 years ago. I think this is really quite relevant, this part here. So human life spans about 3 million years. And the end of the Paleolithic period was 12,000 years ago. So the Stone Age essentially went from 3 million to 12,000 years ago. So when you think about it, human history, over 90% of it is in the Stone Age. And if you look at what's happening in the world today, we're still in the Stone Age. Images which are a sort of reconstruction of life in the Stone Age is the key characteristics as to why humans became the dominant life forms on Earth. And to do with cooperation, organisation, socialisation, invention, creativity, and storytelling. And you can see all that happening here. And like what you see here is sort of like fire as an example. And fire, when you look at this sort of consequential impact of fire, that it allowed humans to actually eat cooked meat rather than raw meat. And as a consequence, food became much easier to eat. And their jaws evolved to be much smaller, which actually created space in their cranium for the brain to grow. And that happened about 40,000 years ago. And 40,000 years ago was that sort of tipping point in human creativity where they started creating language, and when they created images and technology. That was the sort of tipping point which supercharged the development of humans, and you can see all of that there. And this is where we are today. Right? This is Tokyo, which is probably the biggest metropolis on Earth at the moment. But there are other major metropolises sort of running to 20 or 30 million people. And when I went to Tokyo, I was absolutely flabbergasted as to how well it worked. And when you think about the complexity and the integration of what it takes to make a city like that, and you think how far we've come from that Paleolithic era, which was 12,000 years ago. And what you see here has actually happened in the last few hundred years. So one of the things that is happening, which will be throughout this talk, is the rapid acceleration of technological development and how that has impacted the image. So how did this happen? This is a book I read recently, and I'm a big lover of Yuval Noah Harari's books and reading *Sapiens* and all these other books. And what he does is he tries to give a broad sweep of human history. And this one, Nexus, is about how the growth of information, or information networks, have allowed human history to actually develop. And because essentially what he's arguing is that the spread of information is what limited the size of certain societies. You know, so oral societies were in the hundreds. After writing, it went to hundreds of thousands, and with printing, it went to millions, and with digital, it went to multi-millions, and with AI, it'll go to multi-billions. And because essentially the information can be shared, and that leads to innovation, it leads to organisation, it leads to progress. And but he also pointed out that what is sort of one of the characteristics of humans is they are social animals, and their interaction is sort of really based on their capacity to exchange ideas, and in that context, storytelling is a very important facet of their lives. Now, of all the communication systems around, the power of the image is dominant. And these are the reasons. But I think this example actually shows it all, right? So here we have a road sign of a slippery road or ice on the road, and then we have the same message verbal. I guarantee you, by the time you read the verbal message, you would have hit a tree already, right? Because, and for these reasons, because the brain has developed to absorb images so quickly. It's in milliseconds. And the thing is that when you look at an image, there is so much information in an image, like it's multidimensional. And so the brain not only can absorb the image, but it can also analyse the image and interpret the image. And that's why it's more superior to, say, verbal thinking. The other thing about images is it transcends languages. I mean, that road sign would work in any language. And the way the humans recognise shapes, faces, symbols instantaneously, and we'll look at some of that through this talk. And that's one of the reasons why. And in fact, this started at the dawn of humanity because it was a survival mechanism. I mean, if you were out hunting, you needed to instantaneously be able to see what was happening in your environment. It was a fight or flight mechanism. Or if you're a hunter, if you're a gatherer, you needed improved sight to be able to look at the flora and fauna to decide what are you seeing, and so to be able to discern the differences. So what happened is the human brain and the eye, because the eye is essentially an extension of the brain, developed through evolution to be as powerful as it is now. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through all these languages, all these image systems. And what's interesting is how image systems permeate nearly everything that we do. And now, to be quite honest, each of these is a talk on its own right. So we're going to sort of skim through these, and we're going to start with art. But before we do so, I just finished reading a book called Art History, The Basics. And it wasn't very basic, let me tell you. And as I waded through it, I came up with terms such as formalism, aesthetics, modernism, Marxism, critical theory, semiotics, post-structuralism, postmodernism. And what I've tried to do is sort of translate that into English, which is what we see up there. But rather than reading through that, I think really it just falls into three basic elements. The first one is, what is the image itself? What is its construct? What's its aesthetics? What's it saying, perhaps? Or what's it representing? The next one is looking at the context in which the image was created, because the context actually will determine many elements of that image. For instance, power. Who's commissioning the image? Who's instructing the artist or the image maker? And the third one is, what is the image saying about the context? Because these images are actually a reflection of where they created. They're actually reflecting back on the creator of the image, what they're trying to represent. And I think if we use those tools to look at some of the things we're going to come up with now, then I think it would be useful. So here we have the history of art in a table. I'm sorry that's a little bit not clear, but one of the things that you can see is that at each stage, the images change, and the images change because of the context. But the other thing which I think is important is to look at the time frame. And what you see is that the rate of change is actually accelerating as we go through history. And that is a reflection of human development. Human development was accelerating. And what we're going to do, we're actually going to stop in the 1850s when photography was invented. And after that, we'll see that art in another context. So let's have a look at Egypt. Egypt is one of the ancient civilizations. It was one of the first major agrarian. And one of the things that's fascinating about Egypt is that sort of their view of the world is totally different to what we're used to. Because for them, life on Earth was a prelude to the afterlife. The afterlife was the main game. So they had this huge focus on the transition from life on Earth after death into the afterlife. And that's why they built these magnificent tombs, and they filled it with all their furniture and goods and artifacts to actually transition their existing life to the afterlife. And to have a memory of what happened in the life on Earth, they had these images. And these images consisted of hieroglyphics, which are an image form of writing, and paintings. And as you can see, these paintings aren't realistic. They're really almost cartoonish or diagrammatic. And in some ways, you can understand that because their purpose really was to actually jog their memory of what life was in normal life before they entered the afterlife. Now, if you look at the Greeks, they were totally different because their gods were actually human gods. If you look at Greek mythology, they're all human form. And not only were they in human form, but they also interacted with the humans. So it was a very humanistic society. And that's why the humans were not subservient necessarily to the gods, but they were people with their own identity. And consequently, what you found there is that the development of humanistic pursuits like philosophy and mathematics and contemplation and art and the celebration of the human body. And you can see the quality of the representation there, particularly in their sculpture, but also in their art. And this was all about storytelling. The myths were storytelling. The history of their wars and conquests was storytelling. And then when the Romans took over, they pretty much just took over Greek culture. And so you had this smooth transition. And in fact, if you were a wealthy Roman, you sent your children to Greece to be schooled. You know, the private schools were in Greece. And, but their art was similar, but it had a different focus because unlike the Greeks who were sort of focused on democracy and the city-state, Rome was focused on the empire. And so their focus was more, not so much intellectual, but it was more pragmatic, had to do with engineering and technology to allow them to actually expand it the way they did, and organisational structures. And you can see this in this image here, in some ways, the world that Rome has occupied. And in some ways, their visual creations were more to do about celebrating the empire and also the life that they led, rather than having a sort of intellectual focus. But when Rome collapsed and Europe became fragmented, the religion that Rome adopted at the end of its reign, Christianity, actually became the dominant power in Europe. But also the context has changed, because the economy had tanked in the Middle Ages. All the human pursuits that you had in the Greek and Roman period had collapsed as well. Illiteracy was rampant. It was a feudal society. There was no trade. And you had this fragmentation of all these different states. But the power that transcended all these different states was in fact the Roman Catholic Church. They were the dominant power. And essentially they were the main commissioners of art and images, and the images had all to do with divinity. So we went from a humanistic perspective to a divine perspective. And you can see here that the painting is the divine is the dominant image, and everyone is subservient. And you can see in the architecture is that the humans in the scale of the Gothic church were insignificant, and the height and pinnacle of the Gothic churches were to celebrate the power and omniscience of the divine. And all the paintings that were commissioned there were actually there to tell the story of the Bible to the illiterate congregations, and that was the purpose there. And you can see here, even in terms of symbolism, the plans of the Gothic churches were based on the cross. But that changed. So with the Renaissance, what happened was, and that was a result more about the change in the economy, because the economy in Renaissance Italy became more based on trade. When banking started, the sort of sophistication of the economy increased, and there was also an embrace of the Greek culture, which was coupled also with the growth in science and that happened at that time. And so you can see that this painting by Raphael of the School of Athens introduced perspective. So it's very much a humanistic view of representation. It's not about the divine. And even when you're looking at the divine, here, you can see it's almost back to the Grecian idea of the relationship between God and man, and there's no hierarchy in size. God and man are the same size. So one of the things with these images is sometimes what you need to do is you need to look at some of the signals and signs as to what they're saying. And you notice that there's no text here. It's all imagery. And what a powerful message that is. And then you have the Mona Lisa, which is in fact a portrait of not one of the Medicis, it's the wife of a sort of a nobleman, you know. So, okay, upper middle class, but, you know, you can see that there's just a shifting of the power dynamics. And when you look at the stages, it's all to do with the power dynamics and who are the people commissioning the artists and what sort of brief they are given. And this continued to the Dutch. So what happened there is that this is when the start of colonialism and the globalisation of the world, and one of the reasons the Dutch were so strong because they probably had the world's best navy in terms of exploration. So all the goods that they were bringing from Southeast Asia, they became very rich. And the people who became the power base there were in fact the mercantile class, the middle class. And you can see the art here is actually reflecting their life. There's also, they invented the stock exchange. So from an economic point of view, that was also supercharging life there. The standard of living was higher, and that permeated all the way down the line. So even in this image here, of the sort of just the lower class people just enjoying themselves skating on the iced river. And here you have another image by Vermeer of a sort of upper middle class interior. And so what they were showing was just normal life. Normal life. And here you have the anatomy school, so you can see that even things like medicine and all those were advancing with the changes of the technology that was changing. And then we had the Romantic era. So this was in the sort of 1800s, and this is the age of the Industrial Revolution. And what you had was a reaction to this sort of rationality and consumerism and the mass production, which the industrial and these people were romantics, they were sort of going back to nature. And this is when romantic poets and romantic writers and when the arts and crafts movement happened, sort of going back to the artisan. But in terms of the image, you can see the image is sort of not that sort of the difference between what you see here and here. It's almost similar to what's happened with Impressionism, and so it's just that sort of romantic sort of subconscious view of the world. Okay, so now we come to photography. Photography was invented, as I said, in 1826, so we are now celebrating the bicentennial of the invention of photography. And so what we see is the two eras. So this era here is modernism, which actually took place from the time of the invention of photography, about the 1850s, and that went to about the 1960s and 1970s. And what you find there, that was the big change there was the sort of, well, you had the two big world wars and you had the Depression of 1929, and what you found was, as a consequence of the First World War in particular, was the collapse of the empires, like the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, and a lot of the other empires collapsed. Political changes, a lot of monarchies collapsed as well, and there was this focus on individual freedoms and individual rights, and that became supercharged after the Second World War. And if you remember from the 60s, you had the sort of civil rights movement and the feminist movement and the gay movement, and you also had decolonisation. So all of a sudden the perspectives of the world were not Western, so it was sort of like an anti-Western cultural, and that was reflected in the art. So what you found is the other cultures from the Third World, like in Africa and South America and Asia, came to the fore and just sort of say, well, what about us? The world is not a Western world, it's a sort of international global world, and that was reflected in image making as well. But we'll see some of that when we move forward on to the next. So let's look at photography. One of the reasons why photography was so successful in image making was that it was more realistic, it was quicker, and it was cheaper. And if you look at the history of photography, one of the things that happened is that when it first started, it was sort of really quite complex, but very quickly it became available to rank and file people. And today everyone's a photographer, right? But the power of the image, and I've just selected a few here. This is an image of the barracks at Buchenwald in Auschwitz. And what's important about that image is that one of the worst experiences in human history has been documented. And now when people are denying the Holocaust happened, there's images like that to actually counter that. Down below we have a very famous image of Vietnam War, where this young girl is running naked after a napalm bomb attack and she's covered in burns. And that image alone had more to do with ending the war in Vietnam than nearly anything else. And this has also happened here in Australia. So these images of the Franklin River by Peter Dombrowski, that also had the impact of stopping the damming of the Franklin. And this photo by Ansel Adams of the native landscape in America also, I think, had the impact of Teddy Roosevelt creating the national parks. So you can see how important they are. And this one by Helmut Newton, of a woman dressed in men's clothing, had so much to do with changing the stereotype as to how women should dress or how women should be. And this one up here is the first picture of the Earth taken from the moon. And what that did is actually represented an image of the Earth that people weren't really aware of. And all of a sudden they saw it as this sort of jewel sitting in outer space, and the attitude changed that actually this is something that we need to protect, and had a huge impact on the environment movement. So you can see here the power of the image, because coupled with these photographs was also the spread of distribution, how these images through newspapers and through magazines could have such a wide reach and the impact it would have. Now here we have two very famous images, which is this image here, which is the raising of the flag at Iwo Jima, which I think posited that the war in the Pacific was changing and the Allies were having the upper hand and the end of the war is in sight. And this was the end of the war in Europe with regard to sailor. Now both of these images were staged, right? So the fact that an image has been staged does not necessarily diminish its impact, because these have become an iconic. If you open a book on photography, you'll always see these images. And in some ways, this image by Max Dupain, the bathers, is also staged. I think that's a construct. That was not just a snap. What's interesting about this image is that, okay, even if it was taken without his knowing, the fact is that it was framed by Max. And but what he did is that if you looked at that as a painting, you would swear it was Geoffrey Smart, right? It's just sort of got that construct of, so no doubt it is a photograph of someone, of bathers, but the thing is that that blurring of the boundary between what is artistic and what is documentation is actually quite difficult. So, and for instance, this image here by Annie Leibovitz of Keith Haring. That's Keith Haring there. But I mean, he's all painted up like one of his paintings, and he's actually in the background of the whole room being painted like a Keith Haring. And so, is that a portrait? Or is that a painting? Who cares? And this work here by Man Ray is like an abstract painting, isn't it? And what's interesting is that artists were very early adopters of photography. And they were actually using photography as a medium for expression, not necessarily documentation. And if you want to see what that's all about, walk upstairs and have a look at the gallery. Okay, now language. So we talked about how images are superior to language in terms of absorbing information. But language in text is also an image. And what's interesting is that there are two basic forms of written language. One are pictograms, or characters like you have in Chinese and Japanese, and this is an example here, where each word is a character. And it's not made up of letters, it's a word. And if you trace back, you can see it's actually an abstraction of the real thing. And the problem with this one is that the vocabulary you need to actually understand that language is sort of so much bigger than alphabet. But interestingly, the alphabet started the same way. So it started from Semitic languages like Hebrew, and so each letter represented some element in the real world. But what happened is somewhere along the line, the letters stopped representing an item in real life, but they started representing sounds. And that allowed the alphabets to actually become much broader with regard to the construct of words. And one of the reasons that alphabets became dominant was that in terms of printing technology, it was much easier to print with alphabets with multiple types than it was with words, because you just needed less elements for the printing. So what you have up here is the most spoken languages in the world, and you can see English at the top, which is fascinating really, because you've got this pissy little island at the sort of top of Europe, and their language is the dominant language, in the world. Sure, that must have happened because of colonisation and other factors, but one of them was that the English language, in terms of disseminating of information, was so powerful. Now, when it comes to the Asian languages, because each word is in fact a character, when you're painting, you could just as easily, I'm not sure what these characters represent, but they might represent a house or a tree or whatever it is. So if you want to paint a tree, you don't have to paint the tree, you can actually paint the word, which is the tree. And so it's, the character becomes the image. But that does happen with alphabets as well. So you've got these artists who've actually taken text and used it as a creative element. And so you've got Jenny Holzer, who's famous for her neon, and this is Guggenheim. And so you've got the double advantage that you've got not only a word which has a meaning in its own right, but you've got the text which is a physical form which can be actually create a constructed image. And Barbara Kruger does that here as well. So you can both look at this as a composition, but you can also look at the letters. And this one here, Lawrence Weiner, has a form what's called concrete poetry, where you can actually compose a poem, and it's not only what the poem says in terms of its language, but what the poem says in terms of its physical construct as an image. And we've got a work upstairs in our apartment by Ali Cezanne, and this is a poem that you read around here, but the way it's been presented and the way it's been constructed is actually done visually. Okay, posters. Now, posters started from the early advent of printing, and so here we have an etching of Gutenberg, who invented the printing press. But you've got these, and one of the things why I think the posters are sort of so important is that they are a reflection of the sort of power that's actually been taken advantage of by the powerless. Because what happened was sort of like posters were sort of like a guerrilla, you know. They printed posters because they were cheap and you just plastered on some wall somewhere. You know, you didn't have to actually pay somebody. But even though they did that, you can see that these were all of sort of artistic quality. So and they also reflected the art of that time. So here we have this poster by Alphonse Munthe, which is a Art Nouveau style, and Toulouse-Lautrec, which is post-impressionism, and this work by A.M. Cassandra with Art Deco. And what you can see with the posters is that the imagery is the dominant part of the poster. And this continues. And going back to context, this is interesting. This is a tourism poster in the 1930s for people to come to visit Australia. And what are they presenting? A white Australia with the beach, okay? Which is sort of predominant view of what Australia was in the 1930s. But then you had this sort of contemporary artist called Peter Drew, who actually produced these Aussie posters with all these different ethnicities being Aussies. And this was a guerrilla work. He used to then print them at his own cost and actually plaster them on walls all around the cities. And what he was doing, he was actually reacting against that poster that was presented there. And they got different styles. Again, this is the style you have here, which is sort of post-Bauhaus, which I think is referred to as Swiss International Typographic style. And you can see it sort of uses Helvetical lettering, bold graphics, bright colours, and it's the image, isn't it? It's the image which is sort of just catches your eye. And one thing about posters, why they needed to be so graphically strong, because people actually looked at them in motion. You're either walking past them or driving past them, so you didn't want anything which was sort of too detailed or too complicated, which is exemplified by Milton Glaser, who is a very famous, and this is a poster of Dylan, right? And that's all the text that you've got there. But you don't need the text. You looked at that, you knew it was Dylan. That's how powerful that image was. But the most powerful one, you've got this one here, I Love New York, which Milton Glaser was commissioned to produce because New York was going through hard times and they want to encourage people. So I Love New York. So this has got everything in it. It's got text, which is used as a graphic, and you've got the heart, which represents New York, and I love New York. Like, says so much with so little. We get on to advertising, because posters are a form of advertising, and you can see here posters plastered on the wall, like as if there's not enough going on that wall, you have to have posters as well. But then that got supercharged with regard to all major cities today would have a view like this. Advertising in the city centre, which is all bright, images, logos, text, and not much writing, all illuminated, and it's all there to catch your attention. And in some ways, you know, it's almost visual overload. But, you know, it is bright. So advertising started probably, it's been around for a long time, but I think it's sort of got supercharged post-war. What happened post-war, particularly in America, was that America geared up for the war effort, producing tanks and planes and bombs and all sorts of things, and that was a major industry. And when the war stopped, what are you going to do with all this capacity? So basically what they shifted to was actually producing cars and refrigerators and washing machines and vacuum cleaners and things like this. But the production was so high, you had to actually sell it. And that's when advertising came onto the scene. And you can see advertising, again, is very image-centric. I mean, you can see here for Australia, these are past. But, you know, they're using sort of like stereotypical images and a lot of writing. But even here, you can see this idea of logos. And logos is a sort of shorthand image technique. Because in that symbol, it says everything about the company. Because as soon as you see that symbol, you know what the company is and you know what its brand is. And, you know, like Apple, you know, Apple's a brilliant logo. Because what's the symbol of the apple? Tree of knowledge, right? The tree of knowledge. And what's Apple representing? universal knowledge, and the Red Cross for the Red Cross and the heart, you know. This is shorthand, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. But the art world responded, and you had the pop era where they were actually responding to popular culture and talking about what happened. So it's no coincidence Andy Warhol was actually producing Campbell soup paintings and Brillo boxes, because he's talking about what was actually dominant in that society with regard to all the advertising that was everywhere. And as part of consumer culture, it sort of went together. And then you had this painting by James Rosenquist here. He started life as a painter on billboards. So they were big, bold, graphic images which he then translated onto his paintings, and you can see what they are. Like, you know, I'm sure this came from a billboard for some hairdresser or aeroplane or whatever. And so again, what you can see is that the artists are responding to the sort of visual culture that they're sort of growing up in. Okay, graffiti. As if you don't have enough with all the advertising, we also have graffiti. And the thing about graffiti as an image is that it's definitely something which is for the disempowered. Right? And if they want to say something and basically they're complaining or criticising something, just paint something on the wall, and you know, and the decision is that art, or is it vandalism, or is it communication, or what is it? And but what you see here is that you can't beat them, join them. So in Melbourne, for instance, they've turned Hosier Lane into a tourist attraction, and the same thing in Miami, in the design district, which composed of all these sort of crappy warehouses, but they've painted them all with murals and graffiti, and that's an attraction. And then here in Melbourne, you've got this wall here, which was painted by Keith Haring, who was a famous graffiti artist, stroke artist from the US who came to visit Melbourne. And now that's been preserved. It's probably on the Heritage Register or something. And then in regional Australia, all these silos are being painted as tourist attractions. So what's happening is the graffiti artists are now becoming muralists and highly valued, as you can see here. So here we've got Keith Haring at the museum, and I saw them preparing an exhibition in Germany between Keith Haring and Andy Warhol, which would have been fascinating because both of them are responding to popular culture. But then here you have this work by Jean-Michel Basquiat, and he was picked off the street as from a graffiti artist, and in his early 20s, and he became an overnight sensation, and unfortunately I think fame got the better of him and he died of a drug overdose, I think, probably in his 30s. But this painting of his, I think, sold for $110 million US. So who says graffiti is not art? And so here we have an Australian artist called Roan, but probably one of the more famous graffiti artists is Banksy, who's anonymous. We don't know who he is. We do now, yeah, that's right. And but we should pretend we don't know, because it's much more mysterious to be unknown. And so he paints all over the world, and his works sell. But you know, essentially what it is, it's an opportunity for people to comment on what's happening, you know, and to bypass the press and all this. It's to do it on a wall somewhere and everyone can see it. So it is, I think, a very powerful way for the disempowered to say something. Unfortunately, from my observations, a lot of them are not saying much. Okay, signs and symbols. So we talked a little bit about this, but what signs and symbols do is that is a sign, a visual or image shorthand. So with these ones here, you can see there's a plethora of images which we use for all sorts of things, just to identify between a male or female toilet, or, you know, what's dangerous, or where to stop, or where to go, or, you know, if it's hot or cold, or it can be anything. But there are images, and what's amazing about these images is that they are universal because they're recognised all over the world, and that's a simple image. And you can see that a lot of, you know, like religions, for instance, have their own images to distinguish them, and these symbols are actually utilised even in other forms, you know, like in their architecture and in decoration and in their stationery, in all forms of communication, it becomes very hard because all you have to do is see that symbol and you know exactly what it is. You don't need any written explanation or anything like that. And even countries use that. So here we have American symbolism, symbols and Australian symbols, and generally it's sort of based on buildings and flora and fauna and food and dress and all the things which are part of our material culture. They are turned into symbols because when you look at that, you know straight away which country it's referring to. You know, like the Eiffel Tower. See here, we've got the Opera House. Now, this painting here is by Gabriel Possum. That's part of our collection. And we just loved it because we saw it just as a sort of abstract landscape. But it's not abstract. It's actually, when you look at the signs which are embedded in that painting, this is a Papunya. She's a Papunya artist. These set out by Papunya. It's basically a dictionary of all the signs and symbols which are embedded in this painting. So when we look at it, it looks as a sort of abstract painting, but if an Aboriginal person looks at that, they could look at it either as a story or as a map or instruction manual. It's got all of those things embedded in that. And that's one of the reasons why their culture could survive 60,000 years, because they had a different type of language. And this one we have by Tony Albert. So what he did is he just sort of collected all this Aboriginal souvenirs, which were sort of manufactured in the 40s to the 70s, which was sort of appropriating Aboriginal imagery and Aboriginal stereotypes. And what he's done is actually composed his own artwork, which is almost a reverse prejudice. You know, you sort of, if this is what you think of us, this is what we think of you. And so this is a work with sorry in it. And then in the Western world, this is Jasper Johns taking the symbol of the American flag, which, as you can imagine, I don't know if you've been to America, but if you drive around America, nearly every house has got a flag on it. I mean, those people are nuts, you know, like you can understand what's going on. And but everywhere. And so the flag is such an important symbol. And I think what Johns did, he actually painted 3 canvases on top of each other in a sort of very rough paint and caustic, which is a sort of wax. And what he was doing, I think he was just trying to neutralise the propaganda of the flag into just an everyday object. And so again, it was sort of quite controversial. Okay, we'll go to cartoons. Okay, so there are 2 types of cartoons. There's sort of cartoons like political cartoons, and there's also cartoons like you see in comics. And the characteristic of a cartoon is that it's a visual image, and it's very succinct. It's usually one image, especially in cartoons. And what they do is that they use things like sarcasm, caricature, metaphor, all sorts of things that you look at to really drive home a point. And so this is Hogarth, who it was a sort of a very famous early stages of printing, and he did these caricatures about sort of life in London, and this is a cartoon of William Pitt and Napoleon carving up the earth as if it was a sort of chicken sitting on a plate for them to actually choose which bits they want. And they're so powerful because you just look at that and you say straight away. But I thought I'd put this one in here just to give you an idea of the sequencing of images, right? So this is a painting by Emmanuel Fox, and he was commissioned to paint an image of Cook's Landing when he first landed on the soil of Australia for the celebrating the Federation, right? So you can understand that, you know, the view of Australians at that time was that Australia was a white country and that Captain Cook was the hero because he discovered Australia, and that is the image of behind the country. And you can see in the background you've got 2 Aboriginals who are sort of standing there. So you've got this painting which was painted much later by an Aboriginal artist whose name is, let me think, Daniel Boyd. And what he did is he sort of reproduced that painting and just with two small devices changed the whole meaning. So you can see there's the eye patch on Captain Cook and the skull and crossbones on the Union Jack, and he called it, we call them pirates down here, right? And essentially what he's saying is Cook didn't discover Australia, he stole Australia, right? Because that's what pirates do. They rob people. And then this cartoon, which I think takes the cake, happened during the period of the boat people. And so you've got two Aboriginals looking at the Captain Cook's boat approaching. And he says, what are these damn boat people doing here? They've got nothing to do with us. What they know, they don't know our culture, they don't know how we operate here, and it was sort of like a total piss take on what was reading in the newspapers about all the asylum seekers and queue jumpers and things that were happening, and it was sort of really quite brilliant. Okay, so let's look at cartoons. So cartoons, it's interesting, when cartoons started, it was actually coincided with the flood of Japanese woodblock prints that came into Europe because they were sort of fascinated. And one of the things about the woodblock prints is that they were quite flat. They didn't have any tone. They had these outlines and they had no text. And in many ways, this is sort of like a precursor to the way that the cartoons in comics were actually formed. And in fact, there's a big culture of comics in Japan with their manga books. But one of the earlier founders of comics in America was Disney, and so he created all these characters which were sort of animals but with human characteristics, and they all had different personalities. And in some ways you could see that this is just an extension of what happened with kids' fairy tales. You know, like the Three Little Pigs and Red Riding Hood, and he became very successful. And not only did he produce comics, so what was good about comics? Well, there's a huge attraction to kids in terms of imagery, because if they couldn't read very well, because the main driver in comics is actual visuals. And in some cases, you don't even need to read the text to understand what's going on. So for kids, it was fantastic. They were cheap to produce, and it was an entree for many children into reading. And so he became very successful, and you know, he did sort of short movies and then feature-length movies, and then he went into theme parks and theatre productions and all sorts of things like this. But what I find really ironic is that here we have an image of animals with human characteristics, right? And here we have humans dressed up as cartoon characters. But, you know, comics were not only for children, and you had something like Peanuts, for instance, which almost was a philosophical treatise as to what was going on. So these are sort of comics for sort of teenage kids or young adults, and also adults to enjoy them. Now, one of the things about caricature, which is one of the features of comics, is that also it can have a lot of bad imagery. And I think one of the examples, for instance, is what happened in Nazi Germany, where Jews were actually pictured as rats. And essentially what they were doing is they were positioning the consciousness of Jews as vermin. So therefore, the step from categorising someone as vermin and then moving to extermination is not quite a big jump. And you can see that these caricatures of Jews, which have been right throughout since printing started, like this one here, like this one here. This is one of the age-old caricatures of a Jew. and he is responsible for inoculations, right, which happened during the COVID, which is sort of, right. Now, what happened was that in the 80s, Art Spiegelman, who was a cartoonist, produced this series of stories called Mouse. And essentially he was telling the story of his parents, who were survivors of Auschwitz. And what he did is which was quite controversial, he actually pictured the Jews as mice, the Nazis as cats, and the Poles as pigs. And he used that imagery as comics. And at first it was serialised, so it started in the 80s and finished in the 90s, and then it was published as a graphic novel. And it won the Pulitzer Prize in the early 90s, and in many schools this has become mandatory reading of the curriculum, because what it is, it sort of tells the story from a perspective that kids can understand it. And one statistic I read, for instance, that 70% of primary school children today have never heard of the Holocaust, right? And so that's the power of the image in that regard, which is in fact turning on its head the sort of caricatures that were applied to Jews and using it as a defence. The other thing that also happened in the 30s was the invention of the superhero. And all the main superhero characters were actually created by Jewish artists. And that includes Superman, Captain America, Batman, Spider-Man, the Avengers, Hulk. And you sort of think, so why do you need a superhero? But the Jews came from, these artists were actually children of Jews who had emigrated to New York from Europe in the sort of early 1900s, essentially to escape anti-Semitism. And so they grew up with this background, and there's this mythology about the Golem, which is this character here, which was supposedly created by this rabbi in Prague to create this giant out of clay who was going to protect all the Jews. So he was the superhero in the 16th century. And so I think there's a fantastic book by Michael Chabon called Cavalier in Clay, which just talks about this whole scene, and it's a fantastic book. It just gives you an idea as to the sort of natural environment these guys were in and the forces that actually led to this, but it was done through comics. It was done through comics. So today, I think everyone's forgotten the history of it, and the idea of a superhero, like today, every time there's some calamity, everyone's looking for a superhero who's going to come to the fore, but they don't exist. Okay, so you can see, again, like we had with Andy Warhol, you have artists who've responded to this popular culture. So here you have Roy Lichtenstein, who's actually used sort of cartoon typology to actually express his artworks. And they're also quite witty and quite funny. But this is here. This is one of my favourite cartoons. This is a Looney Tunes cartoon, and I don't know if you've seen it, but you should go on YouTube to have a look at this. This is Elmer Fudd, who's actually chasing Daffy Duck and Bugs Bunny through the Louvre, right? And they all trying to hide in the famous paintings in the Louvre. And so this one here, they're in a Dali painting, and Elmer Fudd wants to shoot him, but his rifle has melted like the clock has. Yeah? And then they go into Seurat's painting and all the different paintings, and it's almost a classic example of art history. But you can see also what happened is that you have these what they call graphic novels. They're not called comics, they're called graphic novels, about serious literature, like the Bible and Hamlet, which is an introduction for kids who don't actually like to read, to get them into the idea of understanding stories, storytelling, and serious literature. But one of my favourites is Mad magazine. I used to collect Mad magazines. I then gave them to my son, who then gave it to his kids, and everyone was sort of breaking up laughing because they actually satirised everything, and it was all done through comics, and they're very clever and very adult and very funny. Okay, let's move forward. Okay, we're on to the digital world. Now, if you think the power of the image was powerful, you should wait till you get to the digital age, right? Now, just have a look at this list. Unfortunately, it's a little bit blurred, but these statistics talk about the penetration of the digital world around the world in terms of its reach. This is particularly social media. And even things like emojis, you know, like there's a shortcut to a message. You know, people don't talk to each other, they just sort of send an emoji, you know. And I think someone actually wrote a novel with only emojis. Right? And so here you can talk about some of the things like image and visual content. They dominate social media, 60,000 times faster than text. Recall 65% of information if paired with images. And platform algorithms are designed to prioritise visual content. So images and videos have the majority of clicks, shares and comments, and so on it goes forth. So in some ways, the digital world is actually geared to promotion of images. But when you look at art, you can see that these are some of the works by some of the world's famous digital artists, and the art is different. What they're not trying to recreate sort of traditional art like paintings and sculpture through the digital vein. What characterises this art is that it is immersive and experiential, and it's dynamic. And so, you know, like Rifak Anatol, he had a major installation at the NGV, which was part of the Triennial, I think, last year or 2 years ago. And amazing work. It was in the main lobby. It was gigantic. And basically what he does is he just uses the data on the internet as his raw material to create those works. And also what I haven't shown here is there's another crowd called Team Lab, and their art is actually interactive. You can actually touch the wall and the image changes. So let's go on to the next one. So this is AI. This is the current world we're living in at the moment. As you know, the way AI works, I suppose what differentiates AI from the digital world is that the digital world actually works towards algorithms which are pre-programmed, whereas AI has got the capacity to actually adapt to the instruction and manipulate the data a little bit more flexibly than what happens in digital. And now people are worried that it's going to get to the point where it's sentient and can do its own thing and take over the world and we're all dead. So I don't think so. Anyway, but let's have a look at this work here. This is a portrait of Rembrandt that Rembrandt did himself. And this is a portrait by AI in the style of Rembrandt, which is pretty good, don't you think? But that's what AI can do. AI can actually follow certain instructions, but it can't think. Like this one here is what I got onto one of the AI programs, and I said, I want an oil painting of a still life, and that came back to me in about 10 seconds. And this is another one here of a sort of constructivist type work. But this is a work of a self-portrait which AI had produced, which, you know, you'd sort of think to yourself, oh, it's not fantastic, is it? You know, Christie sold that for 432,000 American dollars. And here we have a robot called AD, I think her name is. And she painted these two works, and I think they sold for over $1 million, right? Now, I think, look, there's a lot of hoopla going on there, and we don't know really. But look, it is without doubt a powerful tool, And so when we get up to the wrap-up, which is where we're at the moment, is to, let's just go through this quickly. They told me you have to go through this quickly. So images are more powerful and dominant today than in the past. Without a doubt, images are now even more powerful than they were previously. There are 14 trillion images stored on the internet, right? So as a database for people to use, it is immense. Daily uploads exceed 3.2 billion. 2024, 2 trillion photos were taken globally. Now, I think the invention of photography revolutionised art, but artists didn't disappear. They just reinvented themselves. And so artists today are using digital technology to create something that's different to what they did in the past. So, you know, if you look at AI as a powerful tool with regard to creating images, it's got this huge database to work for. And I thought that something which I read on the internet is that artists are going to change. So rather than thinking of the artist as the artisan, as the person who actually creates the artwork, artists are going to become more like art directors, where actually what they're going to do is that they're going to actually not only initiate the idea, but actually manage the construction, the formulation or creation of the idea. But no doubt art will change, as will the images, and so who knows what the future holds. But nonetheless, I think when you look at human physiology and the way that we absorb images, that's not going to change. And so images will still be powerful. Okay, thank you. So.